Hi, I'm Richard Costello, and thank you for tuning in to episode number 3 of the Castler podcast. Today, I'm joined by freelance B2B copywriter and content strategist Tom Waring. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Richard, cheers for having me. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming on. So today we're going to be talking about B2B content, copy, and the broader creative process. But firstly, I thought it'd be great to give listeners a bit more context about who you are and your career to date.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a B2B mainly copywriter and content writer. I've been doing that for about 6 years. So I started at a B2B agency as a grad in a kind of account handler, client services kind of role. I did that for about 6 months, and then quite quickly moved on to the copy team, which I think was a much better fit. And then I was there for about 3 years, and then I moved briefly to another B2B agency, and then I decided to kind of strike out and go freelance. So I've been doing that for coming up to 3 years now, and that's mostly working with fairly kind of big B2B enterprise kind of accounts and agencies.
Let's dive into the questions then. To begin with, I guess, just on B2B content. So from your perspective, what are the forms that B2B content can take?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it can be anything really. So anything that contributes to a marketing campaign, anything that sales might need to support them, anything that is going to support brand campaign as well. So if just kind of listing out some of the formats, I suppose you've got your short form like video and out of home and social, so LinkedIn advertising or Twitter advertising, things like that. Then you've got your mid form content, so that tends to be the bulk of what I do, and I think the bulk of what most B2B campaigns tend to create, which is things like web pages, blogs, a lot of sales enablement stuff as well. So like meeting leave behinds, brochures, things that kind of are going to help sales to communicate with their audience about what the solutions they're selling do. And then you've got your long form content. So that's things like white papers and ebooks, which I suspect don't really exist in the same way in B2C. So I think in B2B you're working a lot of the time with quite complicated propositions, especially in tech. So things like a white paper, that might actually be the best way to communicate something really complex, like a new kind of mobile network or a new AI proposition. So yeah, I think white papers and ebooks and that longer side of things can be a really nice kind of different way that B2B kind of engages with people.
Yeah, and you mentioned like mid length, was it that you mentioned as a?
I think I called it mid form.
Right,
I'm not sure that
mid-form,
that's actually a thing.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah. So like mid, like you mentioned, that's a particular focus that ends up being maybe where you kind of are sort of centered particularly. Is that because it's a preference for you or something that you're particularly good at, or do you think that's a kind of a B2B also kind of that's just where most B2B content is focused?
I think it's both really. I get asked to do short, medium, and long form pretty consistently. I'd say the medium form stuff is just what makes up the bulk of a lot of campaigns. So a typical kind of B2B campaign, you're going to need some sort of web page where stuff can be hosted and where you can send prospects to kind of find out more about things and where you can host resources. So a lot of web content is kind of to be expected, I think. I don't think it's necessarily a preference for me, but I think it's just it's also the type of content that has the most variation within it. I think a lot of short form content in B2B tends to be social posts and social advertising. And I think that can also tend to be quite repetitive, and quite it tends to be a lot of bulk and not necessarily a lot of thought that goes into it. Whereas I think when you get to the kind of mid form, you're able to kind of dig in a little bit more to what these propositions actually mean. And I think you need a bit more of that kind of medium form content to really bulk out a kind of a campaign when you're talking about a tech proposition.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And do you have a personal favorite in terms of to work on? It sounds as though probably that wouldn't maybe be the short form, but maybe the mid form or the long form.
Yeah, I do. I find a lot of I find a lot of social content to be a bit of not a drag. I think it's quite difficult to do well in the time scales and with the kinds of briefs that you're working with a lot of the time in B2B. I think it's quite a difficult thing to get right. It's more suited to things like B2C where there's more brand salience and you can be more playful and you're not trying to actually explain things to people.
Yeah.
But I suppose I really like anything that's a kind of contained medium form piece of content. So like blogs, I really enjoy writing because you're trying to come up with a perspective and an opinion, and then you've got say 800 words to just speak to that. And I find that is one of the more enjoyable challenges you kind of get, I think.
Yeah. Where does good content and copy start?
I think the thing you always really want with any piece of content is like a really clear intention and context for it. Because I think if you don't know what a piece of content is trying to achieve, so who the audience are, what you want them to think at the end of it, and what you want their next action to be, what the intention of the piece is, that's when you end up kind of leaning into just spouting facts and figures and proof points and things like that, and you don't actually take the audience on any sort of journey in terms of why they should care about something, what the unique perspective of the brand you're talking for is in the market. And I think, as long as you can write with a sort of specific purpose, you can come up with something that is going to, at the very least, feel unique and have a unique purpose.
And whose job is that as well in terms of, do you see that as being your job as the copywriter strategist, or is that a client? Or
I think it varies. I think working with agencies, you do get to work with a lot of really great strategists who often have done some of that work for you. But I don't necessarily think it matters whose job it is as long as it's done. So as long as either the strategist, or it can even be the client sometimes, it might be that the client comes to you with a really great idea and a really great perspective that they want to get across to the market, and it's just your job to, I suppose, be the sort of vessel for it. But I think a lot of the time as well, you're given a brief where the ask is to say, we want to come up with a unique perspective, and take this information about what a solution does or what a brand represents, and bring that to life and give that an angle that is gonna feel purposeful and feel unique. So as I say, I think it's not necessarily about who does it. It's just that it needs to be done.
And I think, another question, sort of sub question on this one would be, who should be involved and how, in terms of in that starting off point of kind of good content getting created, which we kind of slightly touched on. But
I think again it varies a lot. I think in some so say a B2B agency that you're working with, they might have a whole team of data people or kind of inside sales teams who are constantly kind of gathering insight or crunching the numbers and really getting to grips with what it is that's different about whatever is being marketed. So it can start with them. It could be them who come with that idea of, okay, we've actually found something really different that people are talking about, that people are asking about. Can we kind of weave this into a narrative? And then that tends to be kind of filtered through strategists, through client services teams, and then eventually it kind of arrives to you kind of fully formed. But it can also work the other way around. I think you can work directly with a client, with a tech company, say, and they come to you and they say, we're launching a new product, a new solution. This is what it does, but how can we say this in a different way? How can we create a story around this, create a need for it in the market? And then that's kind of over to you as the writer to do that whole creation of that story and that narrative. So yeah, I think it varies a lot. I think if you want to be consistent in creating good content, you need to have enough context about what's different about it. And I think a bigger team, as long as it's managed in the right way, will be able to get to that a lot more of the time. But yeah, again, not a definitive answer. But
yeah, no, I guess it makes sense that it's complex, and yeah, there's loads and loads of different scenarios. So what will a good piece of content have in terms of components?
yeah, so I think it depends a lot on the content, but sort of to the point of purpose and intent, I think it needs to take a perspective, and it needs to have an opinion. And that opinion doesn't have to even be particularly complicated or personal. It doesn't have to be your sort of typical, what did my 18 rounds on the golf course tell me about this business challenge? But it can be as simple as, this product that we're just launching is really brilliant. That's what we're trying to get across. That's the purpose. That's the opinion. And as long as you have some sort of view that you're hanging any piece of content off, there's no way you can't be coming at it from some sort of unique position, and then you can create the scaffolding of the detail and the proof and the reasons why all around that. So I think, yeah, the best thing to see on any brief, or whether it's a creative brief or a content brief or a copy brief, is, this is our opinion. This is the one thing we want to say in a sentence. And then yeah, you can build around that.
So when that doesn't happen, so what would be an example of where it's sort of, you get a brief, and I mean, you might need to sort of abstract it slightly, but could you give an example of where you've been, where a brief has been given, it doesn't have that, and what issues that causes in terms of where it doesn't have a strong opinion? Or yeah.
I mean, I think I suppose you could have a brief that doesn't have it, but you would never I would hope to never end up that the piece of content then didn't have it. But I mean, you do get briefs sometimes that are literally just a list of, say, proof points for a solution. This is what it's achieved for a few different clients, say. And to derive something unique out of that, you then have to go through the whole process of kind of peeling it back and saying, okay, well, how did it achieve this stuff? Why is it able to achieve that? And what actually makes up the solution, and what allows it to kind of fulfill that purpose. So I think it's not that you'd ever have a brief where you couldn't then roll it back and work it out from that brief. But I think it's a lot easier to start writing content, and a lot easier to get to a position where it is feeling unique and it does take a perspective if that work has been thought about up front, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's not, to be fair, it's not a perspective that I've really heard, or I mean, I'm not sort of. I think what one of the things that motivated me to want to have the conversation on the podcast with you was because of the fact that where I've created content, it's typically been outside of any kind of formal briefing process.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been like, because I've never worked in a kind of copywriting or kind of creative role, but in the process of kind of, in various different roles and situations, I have done some content or worked with people who are creating content. So, I think that's why it's interesting to kind of speak to somebody that's in that process all the time and kind of hear about it.
Yeah.
And what are the biggest challenges for creating B2B content?
I think the biggest challenges for creating B2B content are trying to take propositions that I think I mentioned earlier tend to be quite they tend to be quite complicated a lot of the time. They also tend to be quite overlapping with other businesses, so there isn't a tremendous amount of genuine differentiation, I think, in B2B and especially in tech. I think obviously that there are businesses that do innovate, and all businesses would claim that they're innovating all the time. But I think that it's definitely the case that to some extent you have a lot of B2B brands that do 90% the same things as each other, that are all competing over the kind of same part of the market. And I think that's kind of in tension with the idea that you need to be saying something that's unique and something that is different to each other. And I think that's where actually in B2B the writing and the creative processes in it actually do hold quite a lot of value, because you need to be able to think with some level of abstraction and be able to work with clients and kind of dig into those propositions to find the little nuances that are different, and then use that to build kind of messages that are going to feel salient and are going to feel important, and kind of turn those small points of differentiation into bigger stories. So that's quite challenging.
That's a really good point.
I think that's a really challenging process.
Because I think that resonates a lot in terms of, I think I've sort of come across that, like, I guess hearing you say that, because I can think of examples, where you read a piece of, where you look at a piece of content, and then you can see that it's really focusing on a very specific thing because of the fact it's in a very niche thing and trying to make lots of it. Because of the fact that it's in a kind of slightly like commoditized market, so it needs to kind of. But I think that's an interesting thing, and I can imagine it's quite useful as well when that's played back to the client, because it might, I guess, actually needing to think about why the product or service or business is actually different is probably quite a helpful process for the client to think about, and even kind of beyond the marketing function into sort of the product or sales team as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it also touches on, like, I suppose, aesthetics as well. I think if you're struggling if you're looking at two things that look very similar and you're trying to say why one is better than the other, even just having a better written piece of content that is more engaging, that is snappier, that draws people in more, that in itself is a really valuable thing to be able to do. I think on a previous episode you had, there was someone who was talking about the importance of, like, taste and writing to your writing content that you think is good. And I think that goes both ways in terms of if you write things that are good for its own sake, that that are going to feel engaging, and you don't kind of skimp on the effort of drilling into these propositions and working out what's interesting and trying to write something in a way that's going to draw people into them, you will reap the rewards in terms of how much notice people give you. So yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine as well, as to your point, that you could effectively have an identical product, but the marketing could mean that one was much more successful in terms of outcomes of people buying it because of the fact that you're just maybe highlighting things that people care about more about that product or service. So if like you've got, you know, two identical products hypothetically, and then you've got one creative team that's not in touch with the key elements right now for potential customers and why it's relevant, and then you've got another one that is really in touch with that, and they're making it so it's like absolutely on the money in terms of highlighting the exact elements that are, even if the product's the same, one's going to get, you know, effectively much more interest than the other.
Yeah, precisely. It's the in that sense, it's the same as being a really good salesman, right? It's about taking the same thing and making someone care about it. And you can only do that if it's something that they haven't heard a million times before, and if it's written in a way that makes them feel engaged and that resonates with them as well.
Yeah. And moving on to the next question around, is there an ideal relationship between strategist and creative?
I think, I mean, the strategists that I've really enjoyed working with are the ones who, I don't want to say who are the ones who are just really good, but what I mean by that is the ones who themselves would see the value of the creative work that they are kind of briefing in, but also who engage with that creative process and think as creatives in the same way I think like the best writers to some extent need to think like strategists. They can't just see themselves as kind of execution vehicles. They also need to think about why they're doing what they're doing and what the purpose and what the intent of these assets is. And then I think for strategists, it's the corollary, right? It's being able to think for themselves about what some interesting angles and what some interesting perspectives that this research or whatever it is that they're doing will lead them to. So I don't know if there's an ideal relationship between them, but I think they both need to have parts of each other, if that makes sense, for it to work well.
Yeah, and this is like one of those kind of like probably really, really naive questions, but I guess why are they different in terms of function, given that it sounds as though there's a lot of overlap in terms of the way that both need to think and even sort of do. Why is there a reason that it's just helpful? Like in theory, even if you had two identical people, would it be useful to have one playing the role of the strategist and one playing the role as the creative, just because it's kind of helpful in some sort of process sense to have that division?
I think so. I haven't just muted myself, have I?
No, I think it's all good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think it. Well, I suppose the reason why you have two that are different to some extent is going to be just the way that agencies and marketing teams have always been structured. There's a traditionalist argument to it, but I think with copy especially, and any kind of more creative work, like, you know, coming up with a concept for a campaign, you do need some sort of barrier, I suppose, between the kind of cold, hard process of doing the research, finding out the facts, talking to the client, and working out what's right and what's wrong. You need some kind of barrier between that and the kind of abstract process of creating something. And I think that's where you do want a strategist as well as a copywriter. So you want someone there who is going to take that information and make it understandable, make it make sense, and also condense it into a way that is in a way that copywriters are going to be able to apply that kind of abstract thinking onto, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's the type of thing where there must be kind of a reason for doing it in that way, and like beyond just simply that it has been done in that way. But things like that don't tend to emerge for no reason.
I think a good example is, I think this is why it depends on the type of content, but I'd be pretty comfortable working with a client directly. So let's say a tech company, where they come to me and they say, we want to produce X amount of pieces of content. We want it to serve this purpose. It's going to be on these channels, and this is our kind of messaging that we've come up with. As long as it's just purely content focused, you can kind of work with them a bit to, as we've talked about, come up with what's unique about it and things like that. I think where I wouldn't be comfortable is if a client came to me and said, we're just going to brief you to do this big conceptual campaign, you and a designer, and we're just going to tell you everything about our company, and then you're going to come up with some concepts for a campaign that we're going to run. I think that process, you do need someone, you definitely need someone with a kind of purely strategic brain to take all that information, condense it, turn it into something that you can think about in an abstract way. Because I think if you spend days really thinking in detail about something, it's very hard to then take yourself out of all of that detail and think in a more kind of creative, abstracted kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing you mentioned there was creating concepts, and in a creative process, like it'd be useful, I think, just to kind of outline like what does that mean? Because I kind of have an understanding of it based on experience, but I think I'm super clear on kind of, because when we talk about that, we're talking about sort of, is it sort of sketched overarching ideas, how would you?
I suppose it doesn't need to be. It doesn't even need to have visuals attached to it. Yeah, I think it's just a concept is just an idea and an expression of a message, right? So it tends to be you tend to be doing conceptual work when it might be at the brand level, so like a brand campaign, where say a business wants to reposition themselves in the market, and they want a new expression of what their brand is. So that will be visual, but it'll also be a written expression as well. And so the concept process there would be to come up with what those expressions are from a visual and a copy point of view. You can also do it at a campaign level. So it might be a campaign that they're running to a specific industry. So then you come up with, okay, what's the expression? Again, these are quite vague terms, but it's quite difficult to sort of explain without a big example.
I guess it's the type of thing where probably just working in that field over a long time, just that's where it all becomes quite clear.
I think,
because I guess for me, I hear those things like concepting or coming up with expressions, and it kind of, to me, it does go a bit over my head in terms of like, what does that actually mean though, kind of thing.
But I suppose
No, but it makes sense, and I know the type of thing because I've seen it. Like, I mean, I have literally seen like creatives where they've, they have literally sketched out something. So, like for instance, for like a direct mail, to give an example where you're going to obviously have to pay to print something, and it's you're going to. So that's where I guess that idea of needing to sort of sketch something out before going to the printers is really, really necessary. So, but I've seen like creatives where they've sketched out and they've created the thing that's going to be sent in the post or whatever, and it's brought to life in that way. So yeah, it makes sense. So your writing process, which I think is really interesting, again, just me personally, in terms of you get I'm assuming it's like you get a brief, but then kind of where do you go from there? Personally.
Yeah, so best case scenario, you get a brief that's written down, and I think it seems like it varies a lot by writers. I think I hear from some writers who really like to plan everything out in kind of really meticulously, so they'll create a content plan for a piece of content, and then write to that. I think, I mean, the way I write is I'll read the brief as soon as I've read it, understood it, and have had any questions that I've got answered. I'll just tend to start writing, because I think I find that I don't really have ideas unless I'm writing. So I think I tend to work out the best way to tell a particular story or get across a particular message as I'm going. So again, I think a lot of people, and they are right, but it's a bit of a cliche that to be a good writer, you really need to be a good rewriter. So you can do a first draft, and then it's just about rewriting and rewriting and rewriting until it is tight enough and and it all makes sense and there's no kind of fat on it. I find I tend to do that as I go. So I'll write a section, I'll look back at it, I'll try and work out whether it's taking me in the direction that I want to go in, and kind of rewrite each section as I go. So I don't know. I don't think it's hugely unusual, but I think, I tend to be a bit more free form with how I write, and then I find that's the way that I sort of I write content that feels like it comes to a perspective and an opinion and a point of view kind of organically, because you're always writing towards that purpose. So yeah, that's probably quite a long-winded answer when it didn't need to be. But yeah, I think
No, it's helpful.
That's what my process would be.
A follow-up question would just be like, how has it evolved over time? Because I can imagine that it's the type of thing where probably the more you do it, obviously probably the better you get at doing it, and then also you just learn better ways of, I don't know, do you feel as though when you first started copywriting that you worked in a different way to how you do now?
Yeah, I definitely used to plan things a lot more because that was kind of how I was told to do it.
So before writing, you would
before writing
sketch out like sections and
exactly, like you create a plan of it. So we're going to have an introduction, then we're going to outline the challenges, then have the benefits, and then the conclusion. But I think once you start thinking in those terms, it's quite difficult to kind of shake yourself out of them. And, not obviously we're not writing sort of James Joyce or anything, but there are ways you can play with like the form a bit more. And I think you can do that more if you write it as you go, because it might be that as you're writing about the first challenge that you want to talk about, that this solution is meant to solve, that takes you onto another idea where you actually want to talk about a really specific feature of it, of the solution, and then you've completely changed how you're going to write the piece of content. So now you're going sort of challenge and benefit, and you're telling the story in like multiple different parts. Again, that's quite an abstract example, but I think now I just find it a lot more. I think I get to better work if I write as I go and I change the plan as I go, depending on what sort of ideas come to the fore, I suppose.
So basically, you just dive into it faster. Is that a fair like summary? You just yeah, and then just
start
and then
writing.
just start rather than that's interesting, because you might have thought it's like slightly counterintuitive, or well, maybe counter to what you'd expect the answer to be, because you might have thought, oh yeah, when I first started I just dived into it, but now I do a proper plan. But actually, to hear it, like, I think that might be quite useful for people who are doing that. I think it's interesting for me as well to hear.
Yeah, I think
that's
it's
the evolution you've gone down.
I think part of it is just the fun of it as well. I think if you're making a plan of something, you sort of know what you're going to write after the first half an hour of the job, and that is fine. And you could argue a lot of the kinds of content that you do in B2B, that's perfectly serviceable as an approach, because they do tend to be quite formulaic, and there's so much content, and it's clear that there are kind of norms and expectations of certain types of content. So actually taking a more sort of formulaic approach is quite an easy thing to fall back on. But I don't find it particularly fun to write in that way, because it means you're always, if you have a sort of different idea halfway through, or a different angle, or something else that you want to get across in the piece, you're then having to sort of jam it into a pre-existing framework.
Yeah, so that it's almost like start and the framework will emerge.
Yeah.
Rather than
Yeah.
And
I sort of
another sorry.
I think that's right. I think there's almost like there's a naturally good way to get any particular point across, and I think you can't necessarily know what that is when you're starting it. I suppose it's
the
summary.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's probably the same with sort of like if you think about like a business development or outbound initiative, I think it's probably similar in the sense that you can probably start way earlier than most people start, in my experience, like because of the fact that the right thing to say is going to emerge when you have a conversation, rather than it's very, very hard to predict, before you've sort of started, really. I guess that's slightly different, because you're in that example, there's actually consequences because you're actually in market, like when you're learning. But I think the thing I've learned over time is that you can't really get around that. And there's very little value to, this is probably quite a controversial thing to say, but there's very little value in thinking about it much beforehand. It's just like, just get in there and start having conversations, and then everything will become clear. And also almost that you've just got to make mistakes. You just need to accept that there's going to be mistakes, and it's not going to be very good initially, but you can either just expedite that process, or you can have it be really long. You're either going to make a mistake like today, you're going to make a mistake in 2 weeks, but the 2 weeks won't make you not make the mistake.
Yeah, precisely. There's a right way of, there's going to be, well, not a right way, but a better way of doing it, but you're only going to work out what that is by starting. Yeah. It's kind of, again, this is going to sound quite pretentious, and like I also don't know how to write or make music at all, but I guess it's, in my head, it's kind of like if you're writing some music, I suppose that there are ways to do that just by the numbers, but you must be writing it as you go, because you want to make the next note sound good with the last 5 notes, right? So it's like a progressive thing that you can only judge based on what has come before it. And I think if you plan out a piece of content and you write to that, you're gonna end up with just blocks that don't have any, that they will relate to each other, but they won't have any sort of progression in terms of building an argument in a better way than the first idea you came up with.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, makes a lot of sense fully. So yeah, really interesting question, this one. I know it's something that you mentioned you had some thoughts about. So what do you believe the role of AI is in writing? How can it be used? Should it be used?
I think I sort of on principle don't think that it should be used to write anything at all. Basically, I think if I think it's so, like, I've slightly used ChatGPT in my life as a sort of jumped up search engine. Essentially, I think it is quite useful for things like where you need a piece of information that you want now rather than having to click through a few different web pages. I think it's really helpful as a source of very specific information, and I think it's probably really useful for things like coming up with like an Excel formula. I need an Excel formula for this. What's the best way to write that? But I think when it comes to actually writing, when it comes to actually writing content, I don't particularly think it's helpful as anything other than a tool that's going to produce the most generic possible piece of content. I think that's what it's designed for. It's designed to sort of approximate the most normative viewpoint and way of writing something based on, all the millions and billions of data points that have been fed into it. So if the purpose of your content is to write something that takes a unique perspective, and if you think that your product or your solution is unique and different, and you want it to sound unique and sound different, you can't really ask a machine to do that.
Yeah. No, I agree as well in terms of from what you said. I think weirdly, I've already, the way I've used AI and has probably evolved into a very specific set of cases. Like, for instance, actually, for instance, editing the last episode of the podcast where I wanted to have like when one person was speaking, I wanted to have that person on screen, and then when I wanted the subtitles to be in one place, and then the podcast platform that we're recording this on couldn't do that. So we've got Adobe Premiere Pro, I think it's called. Never used it before. Would have been pretty impossible, I think, to learn that. Just like, well, it's certainly in like an hour, and to do it in an hour. But I used ChatGPT to outline exactly the situation, and then just said, like, I'm using Adobe Premiere Pro. I want to do these things. I want to achieve this, and it still wasn't perfect, but it was like, if you go to the menu here, etc. And I think it's really good for that. And as you said, Excel formulas, like, I think that is probably, in my view, like, arguably its best. its best role. Like, I think I've seen it be, for me personally, it's just like incredibly good at doing that. But that's the kind of thing where it's not customer facing, and it can also be wrong as well. Yeah. Like, most of the time the first formula is wrong, but then you play around with it, and you probably don't also get to a perfect thing, but you get to incredibly better than what you could do on your own. But I think
because I think just another example of what I think it can be useful for. I was using it the other day because I was working on a campaign for, well, it was aimed at battery manufacturers, and just to sort of create some indicative like headlines for this campaign, I asked ChatGPT, like, what are 10 sort of really specific challenges that a battery ion engineer is going to face in their day-to-day role. and stuff like that. It's really helpful for, because if you ask Google that, you're going to get sort of 10 challenges of battery ion manufacturers in 2024 kind of thing that is going to be quite thought leadershipy and not very specific. Whereas you can ask ChatGPT that, and it can understand the ask in a way that Google at the moment can't.
Yeah.
I think, and I suppose another thing to say about AI is, I think one of the more sinister things or one of the more sinister kinds of explanations for why it's helpful that I'm hearing a lot is people saying, oh, you can use AI to simplify, sort of do the heavy lifting, do the hard work of content creation. So you can get AI to come up with the structure for an asset by just prompting it and say, give me a structure for this white paper. This is all the information I've got. Go ahead. And then you sort of sweep in as the creative, and you take that and you create something really interesting and different about it. But I suppose kind of to the point we were talking about earlier in terms of how people write, if you've allowed a machine to do all the research for you and do all of the groundwork of coming up with the argument and the structure of what you're writing, you've given up sort of 80% of the thinking room to a machine. And there's only so much you can do to, you can make it sound nice, and you can make it sound less like it's written by a machine. But all of the thinking is still going to have been done by it. Again, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's I think I think it's probably, for me, it's like it's become more settled around certain things I'll use it all the time for, and then certain things that I would have maybe experimented with using it for, I've stopped. So I think anything kind of customer facing, I think I just don't really, because and also I think I've realized that if you need to check something, if you need to check everything that it outputs, how useful is it to use it anyway?
Yeah.
I don't know, so it's just because if you want anything to be definitely right, you're going to have to check it, even if it's quite basic stuff. So yeah, I think the main use cases for me would be the sort of things like helping you with software platforms, like how to use Excel, how to use Google Sheets, how to use Adobe, Photoshop, whatever.
Yeah.
Or things like giving it, this is probably the main way that we actually use it, giving it data that's in one structure and asking it to structure it in another way. So for instance, you can give it the source code of a website and then say, can you format this into a table? Okay. And that's really useful and saves huge amounts of time. But that's like a very unglamorous use case. And even then it's wrong quite a lot, but it's still way faster than, as long as you check it, it does save it can cut the time spent on a really boring task from by 90-95%. So in that sense, it's great. And I do, so it's sort of, I have I guess mixed view where in some ways I think it's amazing, but then for some use cases, I definitely don't think it's good.
I think it's definitely a helpful tool, and there's definitely, I don't think it's completely valueless or pointless. I think part of it is definitely just, I think if your job is writer and you're getting a machine to do the thinking and the research and the writing and the finding out for you, then you're not really, and also then sometimes part of the writing as well, I think then you're not really a writer, and then what are we sort of here for? What are we doing? I think I always balk a bit when I hear people being like, we've created the content plan with AI.
I think as well with marketing, it's often in some ways like it's this is something about, particularly around business development, that, and people talk about outbound being like it's about signaling, or not sorry, outbound, they talk about marketing being signaling. So for instance, like you do a Super Bowl ad, is it about the fact that it's a super, like lots of people are watching, or is it the fact that there's a bit of kind of cultural significance to being one of the Super Bowl ads, for instance? And so it signals like we're already maybe big or successful or up and coming brand that can spend so much on a Super Bowl ad. So it kind of, there's a signal to it. And I think that in some ways with business development, for example, there's a need to signal that you're investing time in trying to engage with people. So personalization, for instance, used to be a way that you could signal, I have spent a lot of time. Now personalization can be done, admittedly probably quite poorly most of the time, by AI. Actually, it just removes the value of personalization as one of those signals. But there's still that need to signal effort. And I think that that's a big part of marketing more generally. So as soon as anything loses, I guess, loses a signal that effort and skill has been done, then I think that marketing will always find other ways of doing that, because that's what will be effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think like it's doubly true in B2B, because quite often you'll be sending something to like a CEO where they are the only person getting that asset. No, well, I say quite often, that's quite rare, but it's possible that that's how a campaign, a one-to-one ABM campaign where you're sending this kind of physical DM to a CEO of a tech company. And if you kind of risk making that kind of completely lacking in salience by giving any part of it over to AI, or giving it to a machine that can get it wrong, because it's so kind of hyper specific and hyper personal, the way you're communicating, people are going to notice that. Like someone is going to sit down and read all of that stuff. They're not just going to kind of scroll through it past it on LinkedIn or whatever. They are going to notice if you're kind of cheaping out on them. Whereas if you can create something that is genuinely going to resonate with them, which I think certainly at the moment you can only do if you get a person to do it, you're going to come unstuck, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm not particularly optimistic about its value in marketing, other than really, really prosaic stuff. Basically, that's kind of my general view, like the sort of behind the scenes things, or as you were saying, also just asking it for information, rather than asking it to sort of provide a creative output, but instead provide kind of some context and information that's useful for then a human to take. And then because I think also the other way that we would use it is like asking it for questions like, what is computational fluid dynamics? That was something that we asked it recently, and it's like you could ask Google that, you get lots of articles, not super useful. But if you are, and you can also say, explain it to me like I'm 12 or something, and that is actually really useful. So things like that, I think it's really useful, but it wouldn't be like, write me a message about computational fluid dynamics. So what the next question, what does a good creative brief look like?
I think it can be very detailed, or it can have almost no detail in it at all. I think as long I'm trying to think about how I can answer this without going over what we've discussed already. I think you want to know what it's for, so who it's going to, what the single, as simple as possible, what the message of it is, what the purpose of it is, how it's going to be received. Is it going to be an event? Is it going to be on their phone? And I think ideally you also want it set in a context of other communications. So have they already received something from you before? Are they already engaged? Where are they in your MQL funnel? I'm pretty sure that's the right that's the right terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you want as much context as you need, and as little as you can get away with, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the word that was used when I first joined the marketing practice, because I did come in and I actually I was recommended to read a book, like how to write a creative brief or something like that, and I did briefly write them, like very briefly, before I my role changed and I didn't do it anymore. But I remember, somebody senior saying that was good. It was very generative. I think that was the word they used, which stuck with me, like a generative brief. I don't know whether that's been something, but I guess something that from it helps people to generate stuff from it, I guess.
Yeah, I think briefing, and one of the things you quite often don't get told, I think briefing should be like an intellectual process to some extent. Like, it should be you as the person who's briefing the work, understanding for yourself what it's for and what you want out of the brief as well. I think if you can communicate what you're looking to see, it doesn't need to be you're outlining exactly what the creative work is going to look like, but you do need to be really clear about what a good outcome for you is going to be.
When we were discussing this episode, we were talking about kind of how do you label yourself and you mentioned B2B copywriter and content strategist. So how would you kind of divide up the services that you provide?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I do work in practice across all of the kinds of content that you're going to find in B2B. So I think as I mentioned at the start, I'd say about 80% of the work that I do is for kind of medium and large-ish B2B agencies. So that tends to be a lot of ABM related work. So that can be at any kind of stage of the funnel. So that's DMs, it's blogs, it's websites. I think particularly as a freelancer, I'm asked to do a lot more kind of long form pieces of content. So white papers, ebooks, things like that. I think because internal marketing teams at agencies tend to want to take on the more kind of conceptual kind of work. So they tend to farm out the kind of longer form, bigger kind of deeper pieces of content to freelancers, just because they're primarily focused on making sure that their teams get to work on that more kind of fun work. And in terms of the actual services, most of what I do is writing. I also do content strategy. So that is working with clients to kind of create content plans, work out how different pieces of content are going to relate to each other, taking a campaign and kind of dividing that up into different pieces of content, and what's the best way to communicate with prospects at all these different phases of awareness and consideration and decision. The writing is, I'd say, 80-90% of it. But then I think increasingly I'm asked to do more kind of content strategy work, and also working with teams to kind of create content outlines and things like that as well, which are then quite often handed through to kind of internal copy teams as well.
And do you see yourself doing more of the content strategy over time? Is that kind of, sounds like that might be kind of a direction that maybe you go when you get more experienced? Or
I mean, I think I always would say that writing is my actual profession and what I really enjoy doing. I think content strategy is probably going to become even more important with AI, because I think you're going to get you're going to have a big kind of proliferation of a lot of content that's produced through AI across kind of B2B and tech and every market really. And I think content strategy is and getting better at content strategy is going to be a way that agencies and clients can differentiate a bit, because they'll be able to come up with an actual body of work that is designed to kind of attract interest and keep it and sell stuff. And that's going to having that kind of, I suppose, content block and having an actual a properly thought out body of content is going to be one way that you can kind of insulate against this massive kind of wave of unrelated, random content that's going to be produced with AI, I think. So yeah, I think
that's really interesting.
I think content strategy will. I'm definitely seeing I get asked to do more of it, and I think it will become more important. And yeah, that'd be I think I'd look forward to doing more of it for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because it certainly was a phrase that I wouldn't have had a great grasp of, like, what is content strategy. Just it's the type of like kind of slightly like jargony phrase that I'd like hear thrown about and be like a bit like confused about it. So it's helpful to understand, like,
I don't think it's I don't think it's helped by, I mean, this might be wrong, but I've hardly met any people who call themselves content strategists who aren't also writers, and most of the work that they do is writing. So it's quite tricky when people talk about being a content strategist to know exactly what it is that means to them. I think.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like to me it's just one level upstream from creating the content. It's kind of like thinking about, as you said, like the body of different forms of content, how they link together, what formats they take, and other things like that.
Yeah, which I suppose, that should really be, well, if you're a content writer, you should be thinking about that anyway. And the same if you're a strategist, you should be thinking about that anyway. So I suppose it's just a bit more of an amalgam of those roles, right?
Yeah, makes sense. I think I saw like Mark Ritson commenting on I think he was posted about the role creative strategist, and I think he was like saying it was like nonsense or something. So I'm sure he'd have something to say about content strategists too. So on to the bonus questions then. So if you could advise B2B businesses to do one thing in their marketing, what would it be?
So the piece of feedback that I get most often, and that I see the most often in other writers' work as well, is clients, and quite often client services people reflecting the wishes of the client as well, is that you're not allowed to use any negative language. So you can't say anything negative. It's like it's almost universal in that if you write something that has kind of negative connotations, whether that's like attacking a competitor or even something like writing about a cybersecurity solution. So the implications of getting cybersecurity wrong are that you get, I don't know, ransomware. You get a ransomware attack. Your business loses like millions, and you, as the head of security, lose your job. So these are all quite like bad things. But if you point that out in content that you're writing, you'll unfailingly get the feedback that we can't say anything negative. We have to talk in positive language. And this all kind of, I think, flows from like tone of voice guides and things like this. So brands typically have a tone of voice that is positive, that is benefit led, all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think when you get this feedback, it's not necessarily that it's wrong, but it is kind of completely antagonistic to the purpose of persuading someone that something is important. And I suppose, I've spoken to sales people before, and they never strike me as the sort of people who would be in a sales meeting and would shy away from saying that there's a problem if you get something like cybersecurity or network infrastructure or oil drilling wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you're persuading people, half of your armory is to point out the problems if they get it wrong, or if they fail to invest in the right way, or whatever it is. So yeah, I find that quite difficult a lot of the time, because it feels like you're sort of, I don't know, cutting off one leg before you run the race.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And also, I think it's something that I would also personally be cautious about myself, but you make a compelling case to do it. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of something when we both used to work at the agency we worked at originally. I remember there was, I think it was maybe called the Challenger Reports, where part of an ABM program consisted of sending a sort of a report to a really senior person, maybe a CFO, I'm not exactly sure, saying you're basically wasting this much, or this you could be saving X amount by working with this particular, I think it's a telco in the UK. And I think it got really good traction. I think maybe one of the pieces of feedback was like, I wish my team had done this. I wish somebody had actually done this internally. But I think they actually got a meeting with somebody where they were actually really annoyed, because it was really like saying, basically you're wasting loads and loads, you're wasting millions of pounds. And then obviously if you're going to a CFO or somebody in that kind of role and saying it kind of comes across as being maybe like negligent, but actually they did get the meeting with the person. And, as long as it's based on the truth and you're not just sort of being, just using negativity or sort of being really dramatic in a way that's inappropriate. But so it makes sense.
And
like probably interesting to remind people about.
I think there's obviously like an imperative for people running business to business companies that they have to be, professional, and like it's a relatively small circle of, as we've discussed, a lot of businesses kind of touching the same kind of market and doing a lot of the same sort of things, and quite often moving between each other as well. So I do understand like the caution, and like I think it's not like in B2C where you're going to have loads of context where you can say this is all the ways in which we're so much better than that competitor over there, like do kind of direct attack ads and things like that. Like I get that, but I think it's more that caution spills into, or it escalates into being, you can't even use language that is negative or sort of potentially inflammatory or interesting, basically.
Yeah.
And I think I just think
sort of 1984.
Yeah, I think it hamstrings a lot of the effort that you put in. And yeah, I just wish I wish there was more of an opportunity to let loose in that way, I suppose.
Well, we've got the thumbnail for the podcast episode. Be more negative.
Yeah,
that'll be the headline. Okay, final question then. What's your most contrarian take when it comes to B2B marketing?
I suppose it sort of relates to what I just said, but I think I think tone of voice guides generally in B2B, or 90% of the ones that I read are basically unnecessary. And I think most B2B brands don't have a tone of voice to speak of, or they have a tone of voice that is the same as everyone else. It is, we speak in plain English, which is what you should do anyway. If you're working with good writers, then they're doing that for you. It's we are benefit led. Again, I've explained why that alone is not really that helpful. And we're friendly, say that's quite a common one as well. Which again is fine, but it's not actually a tone, really.
Yeah.
And I think
so. It's generic and also limiting.
Yeah,
in a way that's
exactly.
unhelpful.
Exactly. It's couldn't have put it better myself, really. I think it's there are you can think of some B2C brands that have a really clear tone of voice. It's very difficult to think of as many B2B ones that do. There are some, but I think
it's a really good point, because I can't think of any I can't really think of any B2B brand that stands out as having like a really, really distinct tone of voice. Whereas you can think of like maybe like Lidl or Ryanair social media, or Innocent Smoothie. They obviously do have quite a
like they've thought about it, and it kind of bleeds into everything that they're doing. So I think my approach tends to be check the tone of voice guide, check that there's not actually anything in there that is different, and then just write something that I think is good, because then hopefully other people will think it's good. And obviously that's, you're already sort of encased in whatever brief you're working in, so you have specific things you need to get across anyway. And I think generally you don't need to restrict yourself anymore by trying to meet tone of voice guidelines that are generic. I think it's not very often, but I'm not sure I've actually worked with any of these businesses, but I have heard you do occasionally kind of talk to prospects, and they'll say, "Oh, we've been through 4 different writers, and none of them have been able to nail our tone of voice." And it's an enterprise tech business, and when you look at their kind of tone of voice guides or their website, it's the same tone as everyone else. And actually what they mean is they have been working with writers where they haven't liked what they've written, and tone of voice is sort of used as an excuse, I suppose. Because I think it's very difficult not to get the tone of voice of most enterprise tech companies, because it's the same as all the other ones.
And what would you? Is it a case that they shouldn't? Just so I can lock down what the contrarian take is? Is it that they're pointless, or is it that they're not done well?
Well, I think either. I think they are pointless if they're generic, and I think there is a case that B2B brands, similar to the negativity point, if you did put in the time to come up with a really unique tone of voice and way of speaking for your brand, that would absolutely be really valuable, because you'd immediately be more noticeable and more distinctive than all of the other brands, right? I think the reason they don't do that is either, I suppose, they haven't thought to, or it comes back to the caution point. It's not rocking the boat. We want to be seen as trusted, and that means being seen as vanilla, basically. So I think they're kind of dual points, really, the negativity and the tone of voice point. I think if you want to be if you want to be distinctive, that's great. If you don't, that's fine, but don't say that you are being distinctive if you're not, because it's not really going to get anyone anywhere.
Yeah, I think it would. I can imagine it would. If I was in your shoes, it would really like frustrate me if it was like you felt you had to limit yourself on the grounds of something that, it definitely kind of resonates. I'm kind of breathing a sigh of relief that I don't have to deal with that, because it doesn't sound particularly fun. Was there anything else you wanted to cover? I think we've got through all the questions, but I just wanted to double check.
No, I think all good. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really interesting. Covered lots of ground, which is great. And particularly, I think hearing about some of the specific granular detail around how you're going about sort of creating content, the pieces you mentioned around AI, it definitely resonates, and I think very much see things probably in the same way. And then I really like the sort of the point around negativity, allowing yourself to be negative. I think that's an interesting challenge, I guess, to the way I think about things as well, because I think I'm really cautious about that. And the tone of voice piece as well. That's interesting, and I think I think a genuinely really interesting way of sort of like position on that. So
no, it's a pleasure. I think it's been good. It's been nice to actually sit down and think about what I think about all this stuff, because you don't often do it. It's been great.
And if people want to keep in touch with you, what's the best way for people to do
LinkedIn? LinkedIn's probably your best bet.
Cool. And I'll link to that in the show notes, etc. So
cool.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and speak soon.
Pleasure. Cheers, Richard. Speak to you in a bit.
Cheers.